screen. Hi class, and welcome. As you can see, I have a guest today. This is Ivy Barsky, who is the CEO of the National Museum of American Jewish History. I'm going to have her introduce herself and give you a quick overview of the museum. Ivy, welcome.
Thank you. Hi students, thanks for having me. Harriet, thank you for having me. Harriet wanted me to tell you a little bit about the museum and its lead up to being here. We opened in this very grand 100,000 square foot space on Independence Mall only 21 months ago. That was in November 2010. But the museum, in a much smaller iteration, existed a couple of blocks from here, connected to a synagogue building, Mikveh Israel, which was founded in 1740. And the museum had a smallish space there for exhibitions and has been functioning there since the bicentennial, since 1976. More than 10 years ago, the board decided that they needed to expand and investigated that expansion. And originally it was supposed to be an expansion of that space. When this space on the mall became available, it kind of ramped up the project in a really very serious way. And a $154 million capital campaign was underway, and the plans by James Polshik for this architectural gem on the mall started to be formed. So that's how we're here. I've only been here since for about 13 months, and I've been CEO just for the last 2. So the prehistory I'm telling you about is not the history I lived through. I came here after the building was built and the exhibitions fitted out.
Okay, thanks for the nice brief overview. We're going to begin now with a series of questions that I've prepared for Ivy, and we're going to focus a little bit later on managing the change, since that's the module we're in right now. The decision to create a strategic plan before the second anniversary initially sounded somewhat premature. Tell us a little bit about what led to that and how your arrival might have been the catalyst.
Okay. So that's a really good question, because it's while I was interviewing for the job, I thought, this sounds like an institution that needs a strategic plan, but here it is brand new. It seems odd to do a strategic plan so early in the life of an institution, and in fact, after having just built this building on a certain level, lots of capital projects, I think it's almost as if the building itself or the blueprints for the building become the strategic plan. But a process had been put in place before I got here. We sent out an RFP to do a branding and to bring on a consultant to do rebranding and marketing for the museum. We hadn't done a lot of marketing, or it hadn't done a lot of marketing following its grand opening in November 2010. And in the discussions with the marketing and branding firm, it became clear to me and to them, and I think anyone at the table, that we weren't really what they would call brand ready. We didn't have a good enough vision about where we were going and what we wanted to communicate, I think. And so that was in August. I arrived in July. That was in August. So we very quickly decided we needed to step back and instead do first a strategic plan that then would be followed by the branding process. And that was really a great decision. And in a way, what happened, and we're almost crazy to have done this, but we did a strategic plan almost parallel with doing a marketing and rebranding plan, and we did an evaluation of our core exhibition at the same time. Mm-hmm. So it was a very busy year. And the strategic plan was a couple of steps ahead of those other things, but they were happening in tandem. So, which was interesting because there was some economy of scale and conversation across those platforms that informed one another. I joked with the staff and called it was like having a year of Yom Kippur, because it was nothing but self-reflection and thinking about where we had been and where we wanted to go. And it was a really tough but interesting and valuable process. So that's when we decided to embark on the strategic plan, even though we were such a young institution.
So the firm, the outside consulting firm you initially called in for branding, then became your advisors for that process.
Right. So happily, one of the firms, and the firm that we really liked to do the marketing and branding, was a firm called Met Strategies in kind of suburban Virginia, where especially a lot of museum consultants kind of consolidate, around those suburbs, around Washington, D.C. And they have lots of experience in museums, and while they were brought in for branding and marketing, they actually specialized in strategic planning. So it made a lot of sense to bring them in. So they really did both, with different of their staff feeding into those two processes. So so that was an interesting kind of coming together of things, and they were absolutely wonderful to work with. They were just smart and brilliant and asked all the tough questions, and it was has been a really enjoyable process working with them.
Talk about the nature of that partnership, the roles and responsibilities. How were they divided? In some organizations, staff does a lot more just because it's a cost factor. How did you decide who was going to do what?
Well, we knew we wanted our staff very, very involved, but as a new institution, basically, for all intents and purposes, a startup organization, the staff really couldn't do and wasn't equipped to do the really heavy lifting. So the staff was intimately involved, as was our board, but the consultants did quite a lot for us. And we really worked hand in glove. I mean, they were inextricably linked to me for many months, and they gave us kind of work to do when they went away, and then we'd all come back together and come together again. But it was really a very close collaboration.
The phase now going forward, the implementation, is there a relationship still with, what is it,
Met Strategies?
Met Strategies?
Yes. So some of their the consultants who were thinking about the development part of our plan are still my development consultants, and I have a couple of months left with them, and I'm cherishing every moment of working with them. And Beth Tuttle, who's the head of Met Strategies and the person who led the strategic planning process, a guy named Michael Altman, who teaches museum studies at Georgetown, was the person who did a lot of the work on the ground and a lot of writing of the proposal. He's out of the picture now, but Beth is still very involved in helping us implement, and she's a little more involved with the work we're still doing on rolling out the marketing and branding. So I'm just signing a new contract with her for a couple of months of work for that.
Okay. Let's talk about something that when you shared the plan with me, I found somewhat interesting, that it's a 5-year plan, and in fact you even talk about even further on to the future. How did you decide the time frames you wanted?
Well, as you know, lots of plans are 3-year plans. Because we are so new, because we're a startup, because we have so much to do, we thought realistically we needed to give ourselves time. It's what I've been calling lengthening the runway. So, and to tell you the truth, if you look at the plan, there's a lot we've already started to do. So in essence, we may get to a lot of this plan within 3 or 4 years, and maybe some is just put off to 5. But I thought to give ourselves really the chance, a lot of these things take a lot of, in year 1, we're just forming relationships that will get strengthened in year 2 and 3 that will reap the benefits only in year 4 and 5. So we felt that it was important, again, to lengthen the runway and give ourselves the time.
Okay.
Also, to be honest, the thought of having to do this again in 3 years, not so appealing. Yes. So that's how it became 5 years. And also in terms of the really aspirational parts of the vision. So you'll notice the vision statement is dated 2023. So we were looking kind of to a next wave, to realistically say some of those aspirational things are really further in our future.
Okay.
But we've got the building blocks and the foundations. We hope to get there now.
Right. The other question around timing that intrigued me was how quickly this seems to have been done. If I read it correctly, it took you met with staff and consultants for a 3-month period, and by the end of 6 months, it looked like we had this finished product, and that's not true?
I don't think that, no. I have to look back at that timeline, because here's what happened. In August, we hired the firm. We did a lot of, mostly I would say, soul searching for a little while and preparing for a board retreat that happened in November. So a lot happened at that board retreat in November. And I will say that I should say that was it was a tough meeting. I don't know that our board was ready to be that thoughtful about our process, or that the staff was so thrilled to face the facts that we were not as prepared as we thought we were to face the world. So that was a tough but really productive kind of watershed moment for us. So it really started in November, where we talked about we defined, I think, the core values for the museum, decided that the mission statement as it was really wasn't going to change, and in most cases, your mission statement does stay fairly consistent. It's pretty radical to change your mission statement in any big way, and we chose not to do that. But the vision is where we had some leeway. So we started to work on that. We started to imagine what we wanted the institution to be at that meeting. So I'm not sure that it was really so fast. I can tell you it didn't feel fast. Then we met again in December, another tough but not as tough meeting. And at the end of that meeting, we worked then on what our pathways were going to be. So we had our 4 pathways worked out. I don't know if you want to hear what those are.
You might, and I'm going to, in the materials, Ivy has permitted us to post a pyramid, which will give you some further description. So please print that out and have it as a reference.
Okay. So we had 4 different pathways. One was about organizational excellence. One is about building bridges. One is about broadening access, and the other is about deepening engagement. And I can say more about any of them. But the structure of this was that we assigned a board member and a staff member to each of these pathways. It's important to note that those pathways were not bound by department. So all of them cross the entire institution. So the person who was the pathway leader might have been the head of public programs, but that wasn't, because everything in that pathway was about public programs or development or education or curatorial. So we kind of got assignments, and those pairs went off and did their thing in their own time and determined the kind of high-level goals and strategies. And we spent a while working on those. Then the group would come back together and compare notes and really prioritize, because obviously we had lots and lots of ideas, and we had to rein them in to make some realistic things. So for each pathway, I'd say we tried to limit ourselves to 3 to 5 objectives. And that was hard. And then in subsequent meetings, we added strategies to describe how we were going to realize those objectives. In most cases, we decided to make them kind of SMART goals. So we tried to make them measurable. We tried to make them bound by time. We haven't always been that successful at some of those, but we tried to be as specific as possible in those strategies, and then further to think about tactics of how to get there. So we did that. There was a lot of coming together and meeting in different groups, and then the writing of the plan. So I'm not sure. I will tell you that the time frame, we wanted the strategic plan to inform our budget. So we were in a big old rush because we were building the budget in the spring to be approved at a June board meeting. So we really wanted the substance of the strategic plan to be done before the budgeting happened. So it wasn't the most realistic time frame for the strategic plan. We did rush. I wish we had had a little more time. Of course, it could take as much time as we allowed.
Right, right.
The rush was good. We had that goal of that end date so that it would inform the budget, and we also knew that we wanted to launch that marketing rebranding plan, and that was dependent on this. So it was short because we rushed.
Okay, but it served its.
But it absolutely did, has done
purpose.
what it needs to do. Yeah.
Okay. You said that sometimes the goals that you set, the attempt to make them smart and measurable and time bound. Can you give us an example of how you might begin to measure some of the results of something that is measurable?
Right. That's good. So for example, in and some of these were easier than others. In enabling mission through organizational excellence, which was is the first pathway, which is mostly about governance, board, the business model, and aligning staff, the right staff with the strategic plan, and having the right staff resources and capacity to do what is in this plan. We did, and this is a little bit of airing dirty laundry, but I think we had some staff morale issues. I know we have some staff morale issues. And that's, of course, natural. It's a little bit like postpartum depression. You build a building, you have this grand thing, stars show up, and then all of a sudden you're running an operation. So people worked very, very, very hard. And so the kind of letdown of that and the facing reality can be really hard, and other things. So again, we did, I kind of got a sense of this when I arrived, and we implemented what they call a climate survey of our staff. And we did a climate survey kind of to feel around for morale and how communication and other things were among the staff. We did that in, I think, September of last year, so just about a year ago. So one of the things we put in the strategic plan was to measure staff morale and to see if the culture of openness and inclusion had improved, to see if communication would get better. So we say we'll repeat that climate survey this time next year to measure that again. That was one that was easy to do. We had a benchmark. We knew that, in a year and a half would be a good time to do that again. There are obviously other measurable goals around attendance or around revenue production or realization that are in here as well.
Do different people in the organization own the follow-up of the measurement piece?
Some of them they do. Not all have been assigned. This plan is literally hot off the press, So some staff has some very clear direction and ownership of some of these items. Others we have yet to work on. Others are well underway.
Okay. Let's move into the implementation. And class, we're moving quickly ahead to give you just the tip of the iceberg of an effort that was very detailed and probably very expensive. And hopefully yield the results that the museum is looking for. I want to talk a little bit about the impact on changes. You talked a little bit about the potential morale issue. There was a change in direction. And what was how did what changes were made when the strategic plan was approved and the budget was approved in June? And how was it rolled out?
Okay, so as I said, I think we're still in the process of rolling it out, but I will tell you that a bunch of immediate changes were made. I made quite a few staff changes, so there have been 7 layoffs at the museum in the last few months, which obviously is very hard for everyone. None of these were for cause. These were all really good people who we were very fond of, who were part of the museum family. But in looking at the ambitions of the institution and what we need, what skill sets we needed, what attitudes we needed, what personal goals people needed to have to be here, we had to look at those and say, A, what positions do we need? Where do we need to concentrate, and where do we need to reallocate resources? And then B, where do we need to find the right staff to align with those job descriptions and skill sets that we need? So we had to make some very, very painful changes. One of the other things we did was really look at, for example, our governance issues and the way we had been vetting and recruiting new board members. Remember, we went from being a very small, modest institution to being a very grand national institution. So we have some board members who've been with us, for the duration, and we really need to look closely at that. So we reconfigured our nominating committee, so we have a much smaller, more nimble nominating committee, and have begun to have a real structure for how new board members are recruited and vetted and brought on board. And then we also looked at how we communicate with board members on a regular basis. And the co-chair and I, Phil Daravoff, and I have been meeting with each individual board member one-on-one or two-on-one to talk about their involvement in the institution, their level of engagement for the whole year. So that was stuff that hadn't been done before. So there's a lot on this first pathway that we have begun. That's a lot of the stuff that really takes a long time to see change. So we got started on that right away. There's another, wonderful thing that I think we've done in response to our Building Bridges pathway, the second pathway, where we wanted to make sure we were making forging and solidifying relationships in the community with other ethnically specific organizations, with other Jewish organizations, with other tourism organizations. And so in addition to my going to many, many more meetings, and other people on my staff also attending Chamber of Commerce, GPTMC, which is the Tourism Bureau, the Convention and Visitors Bureau, all kinds of other, I can list you many, many acronyms. We're all going to more meetings to say, we are part of the community, we want to build bridges to your community, how can we work together? We're especially doing that with other cultural institutions. I have lunch with the head of the African American Museum, which is 2 blocks from here, every 2 weeks, and we're working together very closely now. So a lot of those relationships have been formed, and we took a wonderful staff person of ours from the education department who's been here for 6 years and restructured or reallocated him to be our community partnership liaison. So his full-time job is strategizing and forming relationships with some of these other organizations we want to be friends with and work with and collaborate with. We can't invite people in without going to their things. And so his job, and this was, something that we talked about in the strategic plan, which was to develop a position to do precisely that. And so that new position has been formed. Happily, we were able to hire someone from within who had the skill set, the perfect skill set to do that. And so we're very excited that we'll be forging relationships and being able to leverage those relationships because of the path he's forging for us.
So it's a big culture change too, in terms of what people are being asked to do and are expected to do.
Right.
Has that knocked some heads against the wall?
I think it has, and frankly, those are some of the people who aren't here anymore. But I think the people who are here are very excited about it. Of course, change, even when change is good, change is scary. So, and it takes getting used to, and it does, you're right, it takes a different mindset, and we want to be much more open and available and welcoming on all levels. Our in-house mantra now is dream, dare, do. And so sometimes when we sit in meetings, we have to stop and say, okay, is this dreaming? because it's very easy, especially when you're running an institution day to day, to get bogged down in little operational details, and they can really take over. And so we try very hard to keep them going without letting them take over and keep our eyes on the prize. So we're trying to get to yes more often. When people ask us about a collaboration or something like that, where it might have been a staff person's response to say, oh, we're just too busy, I can't entertain this now. And it's not that we say yes to everything, but it's, if this can help, does it, then we look back at the strategic plan, even if we're not looking at the paper. Does this fulfill some of these objectives? Right. Is this part of the strategic plan? And if it is, we'll figure out how to get to yes and how to make it work. So we're at the beginning of that process, so I'll keep you posted.
Okay.
But initial signs are great.
Well, I just want to point out to the class that what organizations need during their formative year or two, when they're brand new, in terms of leadership and management, is very different from what they need when they now are implementing a full range program, when they get the kinks out, when the honeymoon is over, when the real work begins. And I think what you're sharing is a change in leadership that reflects the need of the organization to move in different ways.
Right.
And the plan then is your foundation to help you do that.
That's right.
Looking back, would you do anything differently in organizing, planning, or rolling out the process?
You know, as I said, I think I would have loved some more time. I would have loved to have been able to devote some more time to this, and couldn't. I think probably I personally could have communicated with the staff better during the process. I was communicating with the team that was working on it very well. But I would have loved the time and the luxury to have involved more voices in the project. And part of it was because we had this truncated timeline.
Right.
We didn't do that. But I could have done a better job at that. We're trying to do that now, but of course it's so much better if people feel invested in the plan during its process to then ask them to fulfill that. You know, I don't think so. I think the board, you know, I guess I look forward to doing it in 4 or 5 years again, and
not before, hopefully.
But not before, if I can help it. And at that point, having a board that has ramped up their involvement and is engaged in a different way, and I think it'll be a different process because of that. But I think, given the board I had, given the staff I had, given the place where we were in our timeline, this was a pretty good process.
I want to go back to just one last point for a second, which was when I asked you about the implementation and who owns different things, and what role the consultants would play. When will you revisit the plan to be sure you're on track? You don't want to wait till the end of 5 years.
No, I'll tell you what I'm doing for myself is reviewing it all the time. I'm reviewing it before every board meeting, so I can, and this is really, we have a board meeting next week. It's the first board meeting since this has all been rolled out. So, which is why I can say to you this week, gee, we've started to do, I'm starting to make some checking off, and I think that I will try to in each board meeting, which there are 4 a year, to incorporate what progress we've been making. And I think that also in senior management meetings, I'll be doing some of the same, where we talk internally about where we are on certain of these strategies and what we can do to either ramp them up and to do a little readjustment where some things, now that we're in the midst of it, we realize aren't right, or maybe priorities change slightly.
Right. Or circumstances out.
Exactly.
Yes, okay. One last question, Ivy, and you know this, but the class does not know this, that I'm a volunteer here, and I spend most Friday mornings at the museum in visitor services. There are a very large contingency of volunteers, maybe about 150, if you include the docents too. Do you envision any role for them in your new directions, particularly around the environmental and the change in culture and the making people feel comfortable?
Yeah. It's interesting that this week we had 2 meetings for docents, and at those meetings I distributed the strategic plan to them. So one was today, one was Wednesday night. So they've now seen it, and I've spoken to them about a little bit about what their role is in realizing the plan. And of course, some of that in that last pathway, which is deepening engagement, it's really saying, how do we connect emotionally with the exhibition? How can docents help that happen? So there's a lot that the docents will be involved in. And Naomi, who's our head of visitor services, I hope is communicating with the volunteers, and maybe I need to do something more formal. But obviously this idea of being more welcoming and open, making our kind of our entry experience and our wayfinding through the institution more welcoming, and is something that the volunteers, especially those volunteers in visitor services, can help us do, because that's really our frontline staff. So the first message we send to visitors about the tone and the voice and the nature of the institution is going to come really from those volunteers. And I should add, which the people in your class probably don't know, is because we are a Jewish institution on Independence Mall, the first person you encounter when you walk into the museum is a security guard in a flak jacket with a gun. So we have our work cut out for us and that's just a necessary evil, unfortunately, in this world
and
right
a detector
now.
And a metal detector,
and then you walk through a metal detector. So our visitor services staff and our volunteers really need to help us soften that entry experience, make people feel welcome, make them understand why the guard with the gun is there, and help them engage with their experience here in a warm way.
Well, thank you so much for spending time with me.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And we now have to figure out how to turn off this video since it's a little bit different from the YouTube. So bear with us while we play around, but the lecture is over. You can turn off the lecture while we try to figure this out.
Okay. Thank you all.
You think we do?